The bar hummed with muted conversations and the soft clink of glasses. Seated at the far corner was retired Marine Captain James "Jim" Grayson. Known simply as Captain, his weathered face bore the marks of years in battle. The creases on his forehead and the slight limp in his step spoke of a man who had seen and survived things most could only imagine. Jim was a regular here, cherishing the quiet anonymity the dimly lit bar offered. He nursed a whiskey, his sharp eyes scanning the room out of habit more than curiosity. The warm, amber glow of the lights above the counter and the occasional scratch of a pool cue against felt added to the subdued atmosphere. Regulars chatted in hushed tones, and the bartender moved with practiced ease, wiping down glasses and refilling drinks. This was Jim's sanctuary, a place to sit and reflect without interruption. But the night took a sudden turn. The door slammed open, cutting through the calm like a thunderclap. A gust of cold air followed as a group of rowdy men stormed in, their laughter boisterous and jarring against the subdued ambience. Heads turned. Conversations paused mid-sentence. The intruder's loud presence unsettled the regular patrons. Jim's hand instinctively tightened around his glass as he observed them without moving his head, his years of training kicking in. Among the group, one man stood out. A towering figure with tattoo-covered arms. Derek had the kind of presence that demanded attention. His loud, brash voice boomed as he joked with his companions, the scent of alcohol already heavy on him. Derek's sharp eyes scanned the room until they landed on Jim, sitting alone in the corner. "Hey, old man," Derek called out, his mocking grin spreading wide. "This ain't the senior center. Shouldn't you be home knitting or something?" His friends burst into laughter, emboldened by Derek's brazen attitude. Jim didn't respond. He took another sip of his whiskey, his face an unreadable mask. But those who knew him could sense the subtle shift. The way his shoulders tensed ever so slightly, the way his gaze became sharper. The tension in the room thickened. The other patrons sat frozen, unsure of whether to intervene or wait for what might unfold. Derek, clearly enjoying the attention, swaggered over to Jim's table. He loomed over the seated veteran, his grin now tinged with menace. "What's the matters?" Derek sneered. "Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you're just too scared to say something." Jim finally looked up, his piercing gaze meeting Derek's. There was no fear in his eyes, only a calm, quiet strength that seemed to unsettle the younger man, if only for a moment. Then Jim spoke, his voice low and steady, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Son," he said, his tone measured and deliberate, "you don't know what you're getting yourself into." Derek's friends hollered and cheered, mistaking Jim's words for an empty warning. Derek himself laughed, a sound that lacked genuine humor. "Oh, is that right, Grandpa?" he said, leaning closer. "Why don't you show me what I'm getting into?" The bar had gone silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Even the bartender stopped mid-motion, his eyes darting between Jim and Derek. It was a standoff, the kind that could spiral into chaos with a single wrong move. Jim remained seated, his expression unchanged. But to those who had served with him, this was the calm before the storm, the stillness that came just before action erupted. His fingers flexed slightly, not in nervousness but in preparation. Years of military training and countless encounters with danger had honed his instincts to perfection. Derek, emboldened by his own bravado, reached out and shoved Jim's shoulder. The motion was forceful, meant to provoke. Jim's body shifted slightly from the impact, but he didn't rise, didn't retaliate. Instead, he set his glass down carefully, the soft clink echoing loudly in the tense silence. "You've had your fun," Jim said, his voice steady and controlled. "Now walk away." The room seemed to hold its breath. Derek, momentarily caught off guard by Jim's unflinching composure, hesitated. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. He stepped closer, his fist clenching. "Or what?" he challenged, his voice dripping with defiance. Jim's eyes flickered with something dangerous, a spark of the man he had once been on the battlefield. He rose slowly from his seat, his movements deliberate and unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world. Standing at his full height, he was no longer just an older man at the bar. He was a veteran, a warrior, a man who had faced far greater threats than the one before him now. "Or you'll wish you had," Jim said, his voice carrying the weight of a promise. The room crackled with tension, every eye fixed on the two men, and though Derek still smirked, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He had no idea what was coming next. Derek, egged on by his friends, sneered. "Oh, you've got some nerve, old-timer," he said, pushing Jim again. The shove was harder this time, deliberate, meant to provoke. But before Derek could deliver another blow, Jim's movements became a blur of precision. He swept Derek's legs out from under him with a sharp twist of his body, sending the larger man sprawling onto the floor. A stunned silence filled the bar. Glasses froze midair. Patrons stopped mid-sip. Derek's friends, who had been laughing and jeering moments ago, now stared in disbelief as Jim stood tall, his calm composure unbroken. "I faced tougher than you in my day," Jim said quietly, his voice carrying over the hushed room. Embarrassment flushed Derek's face as he scrambled to his feet, anger bubbling beneath his humiliation. His pride demanded retaliation. He reached for the nearest beer bottle, gripping it tightly. With a loud crash, he smashed the bottom against the counter, turning it into a jagged weapon. The sound echoed sharply, breaking the heavy silence in the room. Patrons edged back cautiously, their faces etched with a mix of fear and morbid curiosity. Jim didn't flinch. He remained as steady as a mountain, his piercing gaze fixed on Derek. "Put it down," he said firmly, his voice calm but unyielding. Derek's lips curled into a defiant sneer. "Oh, you think you're a tough guy," he taunted, swinging the makeshift weapon menacingly. The bartender stepped forward nervously. "Hey, let's not do this," he urged, his voice trembling. But Derek lunged, his movements wild and erratic, fueled by adrenaline and bruised ego. Jim moved like water, sidestepping effortlessly. With practiced precision, he grabbed Derek's wrist, twisting it in a single fluid motion. The bottle clattered to the floor, harmless. A moment later, Derek was pinned, his arm locked behind his back, his face pressed against the sticky surface of the bar. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Derek's friends, who moments earlier had cheered him on, now hesitated. Their bravado crumbled under the weight of Jim's quiet dominance. One of them, a wiry man with darting eyes, took a cautious step forward, but quickly thought better of it when Jim shot him a warning look. "Stay back," Jim said, his tone sharp. He released Derek, who stumbled to his feet, clutching his arm. "You'll regret this," Derek spat, his voice shaking with a mixture of pain and fury. He backed away, his eyes darting nervously between Jim and his friends, who now seemed far less eager to escalate the situation. "Walk away," Jim said, his voice low, but carrying an undeniable authority. "Before you make things worse for yourself." For a moment, it seemed like Derek might comply, but his pride wouldn't let him. He took a hesitant step forward, fists clenched. "This isn't over, old man," he growled, his voice filled with venom. The tension in the bar was thick enough to cut with a knife. The bartender, sensing the danger, raised his voice. "That's enough," he barked, slamming a glass onto the counter. "Take it outside, or I'm calling the cops." Derek's friends grabbed him by the shoulders, pulling him back. "Come on, man," one of them muttered. "Let's get out of here." Reluctantly, Derek allowed himself to be dragged toward the door. But before leaving, he turned back to Jim, his face twisted with anger and humiliation. "You haven't seen the last of me," he said, his voice a low growl. The door slammed shut behind them, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. Slowly, the room began to breathe again. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, and the bartender set about cleaning up the broken glass. But the tension lingered like a shadow. Jim returned to his seat, his calm exterior betraying nothing of the adrenaline coursing through him. The bartender approached cautiously, setting a fresh drink in front of him. "On the house," he said, his voice laced with respect. Jim nodded his thanks but didn't touch the glass. He glanced around the room, noting the wary glances from the other patrons. Some looked at him with awe, others with a tinge of fear. He didn't blame them. Moments like this had a way of revealing the truth about people. As he settled back into his seat, the door creaked open again. For a split second, the room tensed. But this time it wasn't Derek. A man in a police uniform stepped inside, his sharp eyes scanning the bar. "Captain Grayson," the officer said, his voice carrying a note of familiarity. Jim turned, recognizing the man instantly. It was Lieutenant Jack Harrison, an old comrade from his military days. Jack's expression was a mix of amusement and concern as he surveyed the room, his gaze lingering on the shattered glass and the tense faces. "Looks like I missed the action," Jack said, pulling up a stool beside Jim. Jim shrugged. "Just a misunderstanding," he replied, his tone even. Jack chuckled. "Still managing to find trouble wherever you go, huh?" Jim allowed himself a faint smile. "Trouble has a way of finding me," he said. Jack's expression grew serious. "You okay?" he asked, his voice dropping to a more personal tone. Jim nodded. "I've seen worse." The two men sat in companionable silence for a moment, their shared history filling the space between them. Finally, Jack broke the quiet. "You know, there's a program I'm running for veterans, helping guys adjust, find purpose. You'd be a natural." Jim glanced at him, intrigued but non-committal. "I'll think about it," he said. Jack nodded, a knowing smile on his face. "Take your time. Just don't take too long." As the night wore on, the bar slowly returned to its usual rhythm. But for Jim, something had shifted. The confrontation with Derek had stirred memories he thought he'd buried, and Jack's words lingered, planting a seed that would soon take root. As the bar returned to its usual rhythm, the faint clatter of glasses and subdued conversations resumed, though a certain unease lingered. Jim Grayson sat back at his corner seat, his fingers lightly drumming the table. He scanned the room with the instinctive vigilance of a soldier, his thoughts still rooted in the tense encounter with Derek and his crew. But just as he began to relax, the bar door creaked open once more. In stepped Lieutenant Jack Harrison, his uniform immaculate despite the late hour. His sharp eyes swept across the room, taking in the scattered glass and the subtle tension still clinging to the air. Jack was a man who commanded attention without trying. His solid frame and no-nonsense demeanor marked him as a man of authority, though there was an underlying warmth in his gaze. When his eyes landed on Jim, his expression softened into a mixture of amusement and respect. "Captain," Jack said, approaching Jim with a slight smile, "looks like you've been busy." Jim glanced up, recognizing his old comrade instantly. A flicker of surprise crossed his face, but he quickly masked it with his usual calm. "Lieutenant," he replied, his tone neutral but tinged with familiarity. "Didn't expect to see you here." Jack chuckled as he pulled out a stool and sat down across from Jim. "Didn't expect to get a call about a bar brawl either. But when I heard your name, I had to come see for myself." He gestured around the room, his smile fading slightly. "What happened?" Jim shrugged, his movements deliberate. "Just a misunderstanding," he said simply. Jack studied him for a moment, his keen eyes catching the subtle tension in Jim's posture. "Same old Captain Grayson," he said finally, "always downplaying things." The two men fell into an easy silence, the kind born from years of shared experiences. Jack and Jim had served together in some of the toughest combat zones, their bond forged in the crucible of war. Though life had taken them down different paths since then, their camaraderie remained unshaken. After a while, Jack leaned forward, his expression turning serious. "You know, I've been working on something," he began, "a mentorship program for veterans. Guys who've had a hard time adjusting to civilian life." Jim raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. "Sounds like a good idea," he said cautiously. Jack nodded. "It is, but it's not easy. A lot of these guys feel lost. They're carrying burdens they don't know how to unload. Sound familiar? His eyes locked on Jim's, the unspoken understanding between them palpable. Jim didn't respond immediately. He knew what Jack was getting at, but the thought of diving back into those wounds, even to help others, felt daunting. He had spent years trying to compartmentalize his experiences, to keep them locked away where they couldn't hurt him or anyone else. These young men could learn a lot from you, Jack continued, his voice steady but earnest. You've got the experience, Captain. The kind of wisdom they need. Jim shook his head slightly. I'm no teacher, he said. Not anymore. Jack smiled faintly, leaning back in his chair. You've been teaching all your life, whether you realize it or not. Remember Sergeant Mills? You pulled him through that hellhole in Cunner when everyone else thought he was a lost cause. Or Private Jenkins, who wouldn't have made it home if it weren't for you knocking some sense into him. Jim's lips tightened at the memories. That was different, he said quietly. That was war. And this isn't. Jack countered gently. These men are fighting battles of their own, Jim. They just don't have the tools to win them. That's where you come in. For a long moment, Jim didn't say anything. He stared into his half-empty glass, the faint reflections of the bar's dim lights dancing on its surface. Jack's words stirred something in him, a long-dormant sense of duty. He had spent so many years trying to leave the past behind, but maybe the past still had something to offer. I'll think about it, Jim said finally, his voice low but sincere. Jack smiled, a hint of triumph in his expression. That's all I'm asking, Captain. He stood up, clapping Jim on the shoulder. You know where to find me. As Jack left the bar, Jim remained seated, his mind a swirl of memories and possibilities. That night, he couldn't shake the feeling that Jack was right. His years of service had left scars. Yes, but they had also given him resilience and wisdom, the kind of wisdom that could change lives. Perhaps it was time to pass those lessons on. The bartender approached, interrupting his thoughts. Everything okay? He asked, his tone cautious. Jim nodded absently. Yeah, he said. Just thinking. As the bartender walked away, Jim's gaze drifted to the door. For the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't known he was missing. Purpose. And though he didn't know what the future held, one thing was clear. He wasn't done yet. Derek, nursing his wounded pride and the sting of humiliation, couldn't let the night at the bar fade into memory. Days later, after wrestling with his anger and an unfamiliar sense of self-doubt, he found himself back at the bar. This time, though, his posture was different. No swagger, no bravado. He entered hesitantly, scanning the room until he spotted Jim sitting at his usual corner table, nursing a drink. Gathering his courage, Derek approached. I need to talk, Derek said, his voice low but steady. He stood awkwardly, unsure if Jim would dismiss him outright. Jim looked up, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he gestured to the seat across from him. Go ahead, he said, his tone neutral but not unkind. Derek hesitated before sitting down. He clasped his hands together on the table, his eyes fixed on them as he struggled to find the words. Look, I know I messed up, he began, stumbling over his admission. I let my temper get the better of me, but it's more than that. It's everything. Jim didn't interrupt. He watched Derek carefully, his sharp eyes softening as the young man's words began to spill out. Derek's voice grew quieter. My dad was a Marine, he said, his tone laced with equal parts pride and pain. A real tough guy. Everyone respected him. But he passed away when I was a kid. Ever since then, it's like I've been trying to live up to this impossible image of him, trying to prove I'm as strong as he was. But no matter what I do, it never feels like enough. Jim nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. That's a heavy burden to carry, he said. And it sounds like you've been carrying it alone. Derek looked up, his eyes filled with frustration. Yeah, well, I'm not exactly good at talking about stuff. I get angry instead, and then I screw things up, just like I did the other night. Jim leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. He saw echoes of himself in Derek. The restless anger, the struggle to find purpose, the weight of expectations. After a long pause, he spoke. Son, strength isn't about how hard you can hit or how tough you look to others. Real strength comes from facing yourself, your fears, your failures. That's the fight that matters most. Derek's brow furrowed, but he didn't argue. Something in Jim's words struck a chord, even if he couldn't fully grasp it yet. So what am I supposed to do? Derek asked, his voice tinged with vulnerability. Jim's lips curved into a faint smile. For starters, stop trying to be your father. Start figuring out who you are and what you stand for. That's the only way you're going to find peace. Derek looked skeptical, but the seed had been planted. Jim reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card, sliding it across the table. What's this? Derek asked, picking it up. A program run by an old friend of mine, Jim said. It's for veterans and guys like you who are looking for direction. It's not easy, but it's worth it. If you're serious about changing, this is a good place to start. Derek studied the card, his expression conflicted. He'd never been one to ask for help, let alone accept it. But deep down, he knew he couldn't keep going the way he had been. Finally, he nodded. Okay, I'll check it out. Underscore. In the weeks that followed, Derek's life began to shift. He joined the mentorship program. Those first few sessions were rocky. Sitting in a room with other men who had their own struggles felt uncomfortable, almost unbearable at first. But as he listened to their stories of pain, loss, and redemption, he began to feel less alone. Jim was there too, though he kept a watchful distance, letting Derek navigate the experience on his own. Occasionally, their paths would cross, and Jim would offer a quiet word of encouragement. Slowly but surely, Derek started to open up. He shared bits and pieces of his story, his anger giving way to introspection. One day, after a particularly intense session, Derek approached Jim outside the building. You were right, he said, his tone subdued but genuine. This isn't easy, but I think it's helping. Jim nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Good. Keep at it. The hardest battles are the ones worth fighting. Derek's progress didn't go unnoticed. Jack Harrison, the program's founder, took a special interest in him. Recognizing Derek's potential, Jack encouraged him to take on a leadership role within the group. At first, Derek balked at the idea. Me? A leader? I don't think so, he said. But Jack persisted. You've got a story that others need to hear. And you've got the strength to help them find their way, just like you're finding yours. Reluctantly, Derek agreed. To his surprise, he found fulfillment in mentoring others. He spoke candidly about his struggles, his failures, and the lessons he'd learned. His honesty resonated with the group, and he quickly became a source of inspiration. For Jim, watching Derek's transformation was both rewarding and humbling. He saw in Derek the same fire and determination he'd once had as a young Marine. More importantly, he saw the ripple effect of one small act of kindness, a reminder that change often starts with a single conversation. Months passed, and Derek's growth continued. He reconnected with his mother, mending a relationship strained by years of anger and misunderstanding. He found steady work, and even began volunteering at a local youth center, sharing his story with troubled teens. One evening, after a particularly long day, Derek and Jim found themselves back at the bar where their paths had first crossed. This time, their conversation was easy, filled with mutual respect and understanding. You know, Derek said, raising his glass, I used to think strength was about being the toughest guy in the room, but now I know it's about showing up even when it's hard. Jim clinked his glass against Derek's. That's a lesson some people take a lifetime to learn. You've done good, son. As they sat together, the once estranged veteran and the young man who had sought his guidance, there was a sense of completion. Their journey wasn't over, but they had found something invaluable along the way: purpose, connection, and the strength to face whatever came next. Jim Grayson had spent much of his life fighting battles, some on the battlefield and others within himself. Yet, as he stepped into his new role as a mentor in Jack Harrison's program, he found himself fighting for something entirely different: hope. Hope for a better future, not only for himself, but for the young men and women who sought guidance within the program's walls. The mentorship program quickly became more than just a responsibility for Jim. It was a lifeline. Sharing his stories and hard-earned lessons, he connected with veterans struggling to find their footing in civilian life. Jim's approach was straightforward, unflinching, but never unkind. Life's toughest battles aren't fought with weapons, he often told the group. They're fought in your own mind. Derek, one of Jim's first ments, was a testament to the program's transformative power. Under Jim's steady guidance, Derek began to channel his anger into meaningful action. He started volunteering at local shelters, working with fellow veterans who were struggling to rebuild their lives. Helping others gave Derek a renewed sense of purpose. Each small success, a veteran finding housing, another landing a job, added bricks to the foundation of his confidence. For Jim, watching Derek grow into a leader was deeply gratifying. He had seen the young man at his worst, filled with anger and resentment. Now, Derek's transformation stood as proof that even the most broken paths could lead to redemption. Jim often caught glimpses of his younger self in Derek's determination and resilience. It rekindled a sense of hope that had long been buried under years of pain and regret. One day, as they packed up after a mentorship session, Derek approached Jim. "You know, I never thought I'd be here," Derek admitted, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Doing something that actually matters." Jim smiled, clapping a hand on Derek's shoulder. "You made the choice to change, Derek. All I did was show you the way." Derek shook his head. "You did more than that. You believed in me when I didn't even believe in myself." Their bond deepened as they worked side by side, helping others in the program. Jim watched as Derek's natural charisma and candid honesty drew people in. It wasn't long before Derek was leading his own group sessions, sharing his journey with humility and passion. His ability to relate to others on a personal level made him an inspiration to many. But the mentorship program wasn't just changing Derek. It was transforming Jim as well. Years of bottled-up emotions and unspoken grief found an outlet in his work with the veterans. For the first time in decades, Jim felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. The camaraderie he'd missed from his military days was alive again, not on a battlefield, but in the quiet determination of a group of people helping each other heal. One evening, as Jim prepared to leave the center, Jack caught up with him. "You've done a lot of good here, Captain," Jack said, his tone warm. "It's not just the veterans you've helped. You've set an example for all of us." Jim shook his head modestly. "I'm just doing my part," he said. Jack smiled knowingly. "Sometimes, just doing your part makes all the difference." Jim drove home that night with a quiet sense of fulfillment. The battles he had fought in war had been brutal, but these battles, the ones fought for second chances and new beginnings, were just as meaningful. For every veteran who walked through the doors of the mentorship program, Jim saw an opportunity to make a difference. Each life touched, each bridge built, was a victory. As Jim parked his car and stepped into his modest apartment, he reflected on how far he and Derek had come. Redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about using the past to build a better future. And in guiding Derek and others like him, Jim had found his own healing. He wasn't just a soldier or a mentor. He was a man rebuilding his life, one bridge at a time. Months later, Derek stood confidently before a room filled with veterans and their families at a local community event. The evening was dedicated to stories of resilience and hope, and Derek was the keynote speaker. His voice carried across the room, steady and full of conviction, as he recounted his journey, from a man consumed by anger and insecurity to someone who had found purpose and strength. "I used to think proving myself meant being the toughest guy in the room," Derek said, his eyes scanning the audience. "But I learned that true strength is about facing yourself, owning your mistakes, and finding a way forward. I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for the people who believed in me and pushed me to believe in myself." From the sidelines, Jim Grayson watched, his heart swelling with pride. Seeing Derek stand tall and inspire others reminded Jim of how far they'd both come. The young man who once threw fists in a bar was now throwing lifelines to others, his words carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. When the applause subsided and the event concluded, Derek made his way to Jim. The room was filled with chatter and congratulations, but for a moment, it felt like it was just the two of them. "You saved my life, Captain," Derek said, his voice earnest. Jim shook his head, a faint smile on his lips. "You saved yourself, son. I just showed you the way." They shared a quiet moment, the bond between them deeper than words could express. Derek had found his path, and in doing so, he had reminded Jim of the value of his own journey. As Jim walked home that night, the crisp air carried the faint sounds of the event's aftermath. He looked up at the stars, their light piercing the dark sky, and felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. His scars, physical and emotional, had become stepping stones for others, proof that even in life's darkest moments, there was always a way to shine. Jim's journey was far from over. The work he'd begun, helping others find their strength and purpose, was the mission of a lifetime. And as he walked forward into the quiet night, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be.